Please be seated. The Right Reverend Larry Benfield, my former bishop, is one of those people who are obnoxiously good at an obnoxiously large number of things. You know the type? But what Larry may be best of it all is biscuits. His biscuits are transcendent. His biscuits are beautiful impossibilities. They are flaky and moist. They're tender and crispy, chewy and light, Protestant and Catholic. They're all kinds of conflicting wonders all at once. Remember last week's reading from Philippians? Whatever's pure, whatever's pleasing, whatever's commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Well, I'm pretty sure St. Paul was thinking about Larry's biscuits when he wrote that. But if you ask him for the recipe, Larry always says the same thing. He says, well, first you got to get yourself a pig. That's right. For a proper Benfield biscuit, lard must be rendered. And so I hate to have to say this right here in Memphis, but I happen to be convinced that the best and highest rendering of a hog is not barbecue. It's a biscuit. I'm sorry, it's just the truth. And I'm from Arkansas. It's not like we don't know about pigs on the far side of the river. But I don't use the word render very often. Do you? This is a good word we're neglecting. Render can mean to give or offer something. You can render service or justice or help or judgment. It can also mean to cause to become. You might be rendered useless or speechless or invisible or fabulous, I suppose. Render can also mean to boil something down to its wonderful essence, like pig fat rendered into lard. There are more meanings still for this word. It's such a rich word. I guess I've been rendered nostalgic for a time when render could be dropped into a conversation without embarrassment. But Jesus, you see, wasn't embarrassed at all, was he? He said, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. I do realize that's not exactly what we just heard read. We read the New Revised Standard Version here in church, but we all know that Jesus spoke the English of the King James, right? Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. All right, maybe render isn't literally a more accurate translation, but something in that whole constellation of meanings for the word does seem true to what's going on in this passage. And wasn't Jesus always boiling off what's useless so we could taste and see the miraculous essence of things? Matthew tells us plainly what the Pharisees were up to in this scene, doesn't he? They were plotting to entrap Jesus. They wanted to back him into a corner, logically, ethically, religiously, politically, all at once. So they sent some of their own disciples, along with some Herodians, we're told, people loyal to the emperor, we presume. So when the question about whether it was lawful to pay taxes to the emperor was asked, there were people on both sides present, Pharisees and Herodians, each ready to be offended. Whatever answer Jesus rendered, if you will. Whatever he said was bound to be wrong to somebody. But notice how this story takes on three dimensions as Jesus begins to respond. It's not just a word game any longer. Show me the coin used for the tax, he says. He doesn't talk about coins. He asks for one. He needs a prop. Something's going to be enacted here, not just debated. Somebody digs a denarius out of a pocket or a purse or whatever a first-century Middle Easterner would carry around money in. The coin drops into Jesus' open palm. Maybe he turns it over a few times, inspecting it as if he's never seen such a thing. Then he holds it up and he asks, whose head is this and whose title? A moment ago, his questioners thought they were in control of this conversation. They intended to be the ones asking the questions here, but they go ahead and tell him what everybody knows, wondering where the prophet's going with all this maybe. They tell him that the tiny head on the tiny coin is Caesar's, and that the even tinier inscription reminds all coin holders that the emperor was a god. Well then, Jesus says, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. The shiny little coin may be looking comically insignificant all of a sudden. And then he says, render unto God the things that are God's. The things that are God's being everything else in the scene. Everything else. Everything beyond the edges of the silly little silver piece that's still resting in his broad, calloused hands is God's. And it's in this moment that I think the King James word seems better. We need all those other meanings of render floating around in the background when we hear the story, because you can give a coin to another person. You can hand over one to pay a tax or purchase a falafel, but you can't give everything else. Humanity, creation, the sky, the stars, and beyond. You can't give to God what is already God's own, can you? So the story's suddenly not about to whom we hand over our coins, perhaps. It's about to whom and to what we render ourselves. Not our superficial selves, the selves that like to entrap and debate ethics and politics and theology and finances. Our essential selves, the selves where our loves and our longings live, the self that's rendered when everything else is boiled away. The late Robert Capon, an Episcopal priest, food critic, and unabashed lover of lard, by the way. Robert Capon once insisted that the only sermon he ever preached that anybody remembered by the next Tuesday was one in which he burned a $20 bill in the pulpit and said, "Friends, behold your God." It's a little dramatic. It's also really, really unsettling for the very reasons he risked such a stunt, isn't it? It makes me squirm just telling you about it even now. And you'll notice I did not have the courage, or maybe I just didn't have the extra 20, to repeat it. And if I'm honest, to see legal tender burned to ash would feel like a desecration to me. Because apparently something in me, pretty deep down, counts money among the sacred things of this world. And I think Jesus wants that to change. Not for his sake, not for God's sake, but for mine. It may or may not be intentional or sinister, but this passage shows up at least every 3 years, right in the middle of annual giving season. It's a terrible thing to do to a poor priest who's supposed to be asking people to give their money to their church. It's a terrible thing for Jesus to hold up that coin and say, you know, this little trinket is awfully small in the ultimate scheme of things. Why is it again that you render so much of yourself to these little things? And trust me, friends, we priests are the ones who offer up way too much of ourselves to these coins, especially right about this time of year. There's nothing like a healthy pledge drive to bolster a fickle clergy ego, I'll have you know. Trust me, it's to us as much as anyone that Jesus says, look at everything else in the universe that is not this coin. Look at all these wonderful, if almost as messed up as you are, people milling about. They belong to God. Look at this damaged but ferociously alive creation into which you've been placed, the wild creatures and the trees, the livestock and the stones and the cities and the towns. It all belongs to God. Look up at the heavens that you've hurtled your cute little rockets and satellites off into. All of it's God's. And it is the love of God that holds everything that is in being. Surely rendering to God the things that are God's is not about giving God what God already owns. It's about giving over the essence of ourselves to wonder and to awe. And maybe it's about looking up from time to time from the so much smaller concerns that are wealth and politics and power, and simply being grateful and amazed. Simply being reminded that you and your lover and your neighbor and your enemy are all among the universe of things that belong to the God whose very essence is love. we're told that the people who heard Jesus' response to their little trap were amazed. Amazed. It's always easy to assume that the bad guys in these stories all just slink away from Jesus in humiliation and defeat. But if you look around in the Gospel of Matthew and take note of the people who find themselves amazed, well, it's disciples on a boat after a storm's been calmed by someone who even the winds obey. They were amazed. It's the lame, it's the maimed, it's the blind and the mute who are brought to Jesus' feet, but who leave him speaking and walking and seeing and whole. Matthew tells us they were amazed. So could it be that even these Pharisees, these Herodians, these small-minded tricksters, could it be that even they left their encounter with Jesus with the amazement of the saved and the healed? With the amazement of people not who have just lost a little argument, but who suddenly see the smallness of coins and emperors against the wideness of God's mercy and God's world, if only for that moment. And if Jesus' very enemies and opponents could see things as they really are and maybe be rendered a little healed, a little changed, couldn't we?